Hey everybody, Brian Allred, teaching pastor at New Life Presbyterian Church in Yorktown, and welcome back to our series on learning to love Leviticus, where today we are going to enter into a new chapter. As we continue to cover the content of Leviticus, you'll notice that we are all the way down into the area of instructions for holiness that we find in chapters 17 through 26, and today we're going to be looking at chapter 23. Which we could simply call Holy Days for a Holy God. Leviticus chapter 23 is really God's instructions to the people about festivals that they are to keep, holy days specifically that they are to keep on their annual calendar. And so today we're just going to get into an introduction. Certainly won't get through the entire content of Leviticus 23. We're just going to go as long as we can today, and then cover what we don't end up covering in this lesson, in the next lesson. But as we think about holy days and just kind of an introduction to the content of Leviticus chapter 23, it's important for us to recognize that people everywhere have special days, days that are set apart. In other words, holy days, set apart days that serve to both express community and shape community within families, within more of a local community, and then, of course, even in nations, we have special days that serve to express and shape our nation. I mean, if you think about it in families, families generally celebrate birthdays as a way to express their togetherness. Married couples celebrate anniversaries. And if you think about national celebrations, you have the 4th of July, obviously, in our country. We have Thanksgiving Day, which is a day that is set aside by our government a number of years ago, set aside to be a national day of giving Thanksgiving. On the 4th Sunday of November, the government has also instituted Mother's Day and Father's Day as recognized holidays. We have Memorial Day and Labor Day and all kinds of holidays, New Year's Day. And then, of course, we also have religious holidays. All religious communities tend to have special or holy days. That's not just true of Christians, it's true of people of other faiths. I'm aware of Islam and its celebration of Ramadan. Most of us know Jewish holidays like Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, which is the New Year for the Jews. Yom Kippur, by the way, is Day of Atonement. You also have Passover celebration in modern-day Judaism as well. And as far as the Christian community goes in terms of holy days on its calendar, obviously we have Easter Sunday. The week before that, Palm Sunday. We have Good Friday during that Holy Week celebration as well. Obviously, Christmas is celebrated by most Christian churches. We have also Ascension Day in some traditions is a very important day, but certainly Easter, Christmas, Good Friday, those are important holy days in the life of the church. And so all people, all families, all communities, and all nations for the most part have these special days that serve to, again, express and shape their togetherness and their commonality as a people. And so Leviticus chapter 23, we could also look at Deuteronomy chapter 16 and Numbers chapters 28 and 29 as chapters dealing with this particular theme as well, the holy days that God appoints. But Leviticus 23 here, as we're going through the contents of this book, contains the holy days or the feasts that are appointed by God for his people. Again, this doesn't come from the bottom up, that the people invent these ideas and say, this is how we're going to worship God. God actually, by his revelation to Moses, instructs his people to observe these feasts as part of their life before him, as part of being his covenant people who have been created by him and redeemed by him. A couple things to note as we think about these appointed times by God. Again, God is the one appointing these feasts for his people. And that reminds us that time belongs to God. All of our time, all time in general, belongs to the Lord. Our weeks belong to him, our months belong to him, our years belong to him, and so he gets to determine the special days, the flow of time, the yearly calendar, the monthly calendar, our weekly calendar. Those are all under his authority, and we are to submit to him as our good and gracious God, and how he instructs us to observe that time. Also, these feasts or holy days in Leviticus chapter 23 remind us that God calls us to be a rejoicing and celebrating people. And that can sometimes be undervalued, underemphasized, unrecognized by a lot of people. They think that to be a person of faith, particularly to be a Christian, is to be someone who just has to submit to all of these rules and laws that are a burden, and that they never get to do anything fun, that God is some kind of killjoy. And that is absolutely not the picture of the God of the Bible. It's interesting, just as a side note, people have that view about the Puritans as well, that they were just a very stoic, unemotional people who didn't have any fun, who didn't enjoy life. And that is a gross miscaricature of the Puritans. They enjoyed life immensely because they enjoyed the God of life. And that's to be true of us as Christians today as well. We are to be a rejoicing and celebrating people. And again, that doesn't mean that every moment of life is taken up with some kind of sensual or carnal kind of celebration or rejoicing. But there is a deep spiritual and bodily rejoicing and celebrating that we're invited to do with good reason, and that reason is our God is good, and God has placed us in a good creation that speaks of his goodness, and we are to enjoy the things around us as an expression of our thankfulness to him. And so these feasts and festivals remind us that. Keep in mind that the Lord is appointing these feasts and requiring his people to observe them. We'll see in a little bit that part of these feasts involved rest days where they ceased from ordinary work. That reminded them that they were not to be enslaved to their labors, to their ordinary callings. Life was more than that. Yes, life involved work. Life involves toil this side of the fall. But there's more to life than that. We are still in a world that God has made, in a world that God rules over, and there are occasions for appropriate rejoicing and celebrating because of who our God is. He is a good and gracious God, and so we celebrate that. But that leads us to this point, and that is that the appointed feasts generally had an agricultural element to them. They were connected to the agricultural seasons in the life of Israel in the land, but they were holy times or holy days. When I think about holy days, that's where the term holiday comes from. It's a holy day. It's a day set apart. It's a special day. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be today as we use the term holiday. It's not necessarily a religious holy day that we talk about, although we do have religious holy days. But a holiday is just a special day, a day that's set apart. Someone's birthday, an anniversary is a special day. It can be kind of a holiday. Some people simply refer to vacations as holidays. I'm going to take a holiday, such and such. People in the United States don't tend to talk that way, but I think people from England and Scotland, Great Britain, tend to use holiday in that kind of terminology. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I didn't do my homework before this. It's going off the top of my head, but I think that's true. But yeah, holy day, the term holiday comes from holy days, a special day. And even though these are connected to the agricultural cycles within Israel, they're all to be observed with a vertical perspective toward God. Because even the agricultural cycle is pointing to God's faithfulness, his provision, his goodness, his kindness, as the creator, as the giver of all good gifts, but also as our redeemer. And so Israel is to remember God as their redeemer in the midst of these agricultural celebrations. So we'll see that as we begin to walk through the specific holy days that we see in Leviticus chapter 23. Just as a quick side note, we could elaborate on all of these things quite a bit here. But when we think about biblical feasting, a biblical festival, biblical feasting in its essence would involve these three components: rejoicing. It's right to rejoice. Our feasts before the Lord should not be sober, sad occasions. There are times in life to mourn and to be sad, to be somber and sober. But there are also times to rejoice because we live in God's good creation, and we live in the midst of abundant graces, both special graces and common graces, common to all people, but also special grace has been given to us as believers in him. And so that feasting ought to involve real, genuine rejoicing in his good gifts, but also an element of remembering who these gifts come from, what God has done for us in the past. But also, biblical feasting involves relationships. Obviously, that involves a consciousness of our relationship with the Lord as our creation redeemer, but also then horizontally, our relationship with other people. We're actually going to see an element of that very clearly in one of these festivals that is appointed in Leviticus chapter 23. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But yeah, biblical feasting involves rejoicing, remembering, and relationships. It's maybe just a helpful way with an alliteration to remember some very essential components of biblical feasting. And we're going to see these things, each of these three things, in all of the feasts or holy days outlined in Leviticus chapter 23. One last thing before I show you the 7 feasts, festivals, holy days that are appointed in Leviticus chapter 23. But these appointed holy times, some came in the spring, and we read about those spring feasts in verses 4 through 22 of Leviticus chapter 23. And then some of them happened in the autumn or in the fall. And then we read about those in verses 23 through 43. And actually this delineation between spring celebrations and fall celebrations is actually suggested in the text because the concluding verses of both of those sections, so that would be verse 22 and then verse 43, end with the words, I am the Lord your God. So at the end of verse 22, or at 22, we see these words, I am the Lord your God. Then it picks up again with some other appointed feasts or festivals or holy days that are designated by the Lord. And then it goes through those. And then again in verse 43, we again have that second refrain of I am the Lord your God. So we kind of have these two components, but altogether there are 7 of these holy days or feasts appointed by the Lord for his people to observe in Leviticus chapter 23. And so the first one that we see in verse 3, after some introductory language there about the Lord speaking to Moses and telling him to speak to the people of Israel, we first read about the weekly Sabbath day. Okay, so hopefully we'll touch on that a little bit in this lesson and maybe get into the second one, depending on how much time we have. But the second one concerns Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread in verses 4 through 8. I'm going to come back and say something more about these pilgrimage references. Let me move my camera up just a little bit. So you can see that there's 3 instances there, number 2, number 4, and number 7, that have that added feature of pilgrimage there you can see on the outline. I'll get to that in just a second. But the second one, Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread, we read about in verses 4 through 8 in Leviticus 23. Then in verses 9 through 14, we read about the Feast of the Firstfruits, which is really just a day. And then number 4, the Feast of Weeks in verses 15 through 22. By the way, verse 22 is that conclusion of that first spring cycle of celebrations. And so the first 4, actually it's 2, 3, and 4 that are happening this spring. Number 1 is happening on a weekly basis, year around. So every week. Remember when I talked about how these festivals, these feasts, these holy days remind us that time belongs to God. Our weeks, our months, and our years. Our weeks is clearly indicated there with the weekly Sabbath. You could actually even say with the morning sacrifice and the evening sacrifice, it's required at the burnt altar in the tabernacle and then later in the temple, reminds us that our days belong to God as well. So our days, our weeks, our months, all time belongs to the Lord who has gifted us time and is to be used for his glory. But so we have a weekly one in number 1, and then number 2, number 3, number 4 are spring celebrations. And then beginning in number 5, we have the Feast of Trumpets. We read about that in verses 23 through 25 of Leviticus 23. And then we move on to the Day of Atonement in verses 26 through 32. And yes, we've already talked a great deal about the Day of Atonement because the detailed instructions for observing that day are already given to us in Leviticus chapter 16. Very important chapter. Not just in the book of Leviticus, but in the Pentateuch. Very important chapter in the whole Old Testament and in the Bible for understanding the person and work of Christ who fulfills the Day of Atonement. So we won't actually unpack that a great deal again next week when we come back and look at, hopefully complete all 7 of these holy days or feasts, because we talked quite a bit about it in chapter 16. But there are some additional instructions that we see here, and a slightly different emphasis placed here in Leviticus chapter 23 without rehearsing all of those details. But that is one of the autumn observances. And then number 7 is the Feast of Ingathering. It's also called the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. That's where it can kind of get confusing. It says, first of all, there's 7 of these, so there's a lot of them. And then sometimes, depending on translations, some will refer to this last one as the Feast of Ingathering. Some others will refer to it as the Feast of Tabernacles, and then others will opt to translate that as booths instead of tabernacles. It's actually all the same thing. We read about that in verses 33 through 43. As I said, I was going to go back and explain this pilgrimage reference here on number 2, number 4, and number 7. There were 3 annual feasts that God appointed for his people Israel to observe, where they were all to come together to one place. Now, in the book of Deuteronomy, before they entered into the land, that was referred to as the place where I will place my name, or where I will put my name. We know that that later becomes the city of Jerusalem. So, there were 3 occasions, once the people entered into the land, where all of the Israelites, regardless of where they lived, were to come together in Jerusalem. They were to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem for 3 of these annual celebrations or feasts. One was Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Passover occurs, and then right after that, there's a week-long Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that was one of them. A second one occurred 7 weeks after that, which is the Feast of Weeks. When we get to that, hopefully in the next lesson, you'll see that this is Pentecost. 50 days after the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, there's the Feast of Weeks, which is why it's called the Feast of Weeks. You count off 7 weeks, and that next day, the 50th day, there begins this celebration. Again, that required a pilgrimage. So there was another pilgrimage for the Feast of Weeks. And then the third of those pilgrimages, you can see, is number 7. That's the Feast of Ingathering, or the Feast of Tabernacles, or booths. Okay, so you have those 3 annual pilgrimages, which all the people of Israel, wherever they were to come together in Jerusalem. And this might help explain some of the things you read about maybe in the New Testament that you're more familiar with. Remember that Jesus was put to death on Passover, or during Passover week. And so remember that at times the Jewish leaders were hesitant to do anything about Jesus because they feared the crowds. That wasn't just the normal population that happened to be in the city at that time. It's because more and more people were there because it was Passover. There was a pilgrimage that took place there. If we think about that list of all of those various people speaking all those different kinds of languages that are present in Acts chapter 2, that's because when the Jews were dispersed during the exile, lived in many different places. So we have synagogues in all kinds of places. There were synagogues in Damascus. There were synagogues in Alexandria in Egypt, Damascus in Syria, like all over the place. But they were Jews who were still worshiping in the synagogues, who had not returned from exile back to the land. But during these pilgrimages, they would all come back together. And so in Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost, all of these people are there speaking different tongues. And a lot of them are Jews who are speaking in different languages, who are there for Pentecost as obedience to the pilgrimage. And so we do see reflections of these pilgrimages in the New Testament. So hopefully that will help make sense of that in your future readings of the New Testament. I think this is probably all we'll get to then today in today's lesson. And that's the first of the 7 mentioned, which is okay, because remember, 2, 3, and 4 are annual spring festivals or celebrations connected to the agricultural cycle. And then 5, 6, and 7 are autumn kinds of celebrations. The first one is a weekly observance, and that's the weekly Sabbath, and it's mentioned in verse 3 of Leviticus chapter 23. Just a few things to note here about the weekly Sabbath. It's the most fundamental holy day. Actually, the observance of the weekly Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. It's the 4th commandment. And so this is really just a reiteration of something that the Lord has already instructed his people to observe as a holiday or a holy day. We notice also this is a fundamental holy day because other festivals incorporated additional Sabbath days. A Sabbath, Shabbat, refers to a ceasing. It doesn't refer to sleeping. It's a ceasing. It's stopping ordinary work. And so the ordinary labors and vocations that people employed themselves in. For the other 6 days, they were to cease that work by an act of the will for a day that was set apart by the Lord in his word, by his revelation. And so other festivals incorporated additional Sabbath days, not just the seventh day. Okay, so you have a weekly Sabbath day, which is the seventh day. Remember, this is rooted in creation. We'll get to that in a second, because God rested on the seventh day. So in the Old Testament, that Sabbath day was observed on the seventh day, but it wasn't the only Sabbath that the people would have had in mind, because there were other Sabbaths connected to, say, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths. And so there's other Sabbaths. And that becomes important sometimes when we're reading the New Testament references to Sabbaths, and we might interpret those texts as suggesting that the weekly Sabbath has been abrogated or set aside in the New Testament. We'll talk about that in a second as well, just very briefly. Won't enter into all those arguments yet, but we might at some point later. I just wanted you to point out that when we get to the New Testament and sometimes Sabbaths are mentioned, that's not necessarily a reference to the weekly Sabbath, because there are additional Sabbaths that are part of Israel's annual calendar. Okay, but we do have the weekly Sabbath that is to be set apart by the people. This weekly Sabbath is a sign of belonging to the covenant God who created all things. In fact, we read of God resting himself in Genesis 2, verse 3, which seems to lay the foundation of later revelation for the instruction of the people to rest on the seventh day in the Ten Commandments. But also, it's a sign of belonging to the covenant God of redemption. When Deuteronomy talks about this commandment, the fourth commandment, we find something that we don't find in Exodus, and that is, remember that you were slaves in Egypt as well. And so they were not themselves to labor tirelessly, but they were also not to enslave others in endless, ceaseless work. One quick thing to note here about that. Remember that the first audience reading the Pentateuch, written by Moses, was the Israelite community who had come out of Egypt from slavery. We believe that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are written primarily by Moses. It doesn't mean Moses wrote every single word. Moses' death is recorded in Deuteronomy. But Jesus validates this or verifies this view as well, when he'll often say, have you not read Moses? Moses wrote. And those are from the words of Jesus. And so we believe in Mosaic authorship. So if it's Mosaic authorship, Genesis was first read as Genesis by the Exodus generation. And this is an Exodus generation that had spent, not all themselves as individuals, but they had been in Egypt for 400 years and had been enslaved. And so one of the first things they learn about in the book of Genesis is that they're created in the image of God. And that means there's royalty to all humanity, which means that they're not essentially slaves. It is not who they are as people. That's not who anybody is as a person. We are not slaves to be worked endlessly. And so one of the things that reinforces this is the fourth commandment. There's a time to stop working. And notice the fourth commandment is that you shouldn't do any work, but you, your wife, your servants, your animals shouldn't do any work. It's protective to not enslave people in this endless toil. So we are not created as slaves to labor, but we are a people who are actually invited into covenant relationship with our God who has created us in his image, but also invited as a covenant people to respond to God who has redeemed us from slavery and bondage, primarily bondage to sin, to live a new life, which is what Leviticus is about, right? How does a holy people who have been delivered from the bondage to sin live in the presence of a holy God? This weekly Sabbath day, according to verse 3, involved a gathering together, a sacred assembly. We'll see this quite frequently in Leviticus chapter 23. This sacred assembly, they were to gather together. So again, there's community, there's relationship, horizontal relationship, vertical relationship in the observance of their Sabbath day. A convocation. Convocation literally means a calling together. Vocation meaning calling, and the con prefix there meaning together with. If you think of an English word like contemporary, it means together with time. Temporal or temporary is a reference to time. A contemporary is together in time. which is what we mean by a contemporary. If I have a contemporary, if the authors were contemporary with one another, it means they were writing at the same time. And so a convocation means to be called together. We actually see hints of this ongoing importance in the book of Hebrews. Remember when the author of Hebrews says, I think it's in Hebrews chapter 13, do not forsake the assembling of yourselves together. And so we might come back to some of those questions about a weekly Sabbath for Christians or not, because obviously this is in Leviticus chapter 23, and as Christians we don't observe these other kinds of feasts and festivals. Maybe we can, but we don't as an act of obedience to the Lord. One last thing about the Sabbath day was to be observed everywhere in all of your dwelling places. So again, not only didn't require a pilgrimage, it was to be practiced and observed in all places by any Israelite as a sign, again, of belonging to the covenant God of creation and redemption. And so one of the things that we might come back to, but I'll probably be at the very end of Leviticus, almost as a postscript, is this question of whether the weekly Sabbath observance is still binding for New Testament believers. There's a lot of differing opinions on that. So that might be worth exploring, because I think a lot of people have questions about that. Worshiping on Sunday is obviously different than worshiping on the seventh day, worshiping on the first day. So is the Christian worship on Sunday an act of obedience to the fourth commandment? Or is the fourth commandment set aside? Are all the commandments set aside? Is it just the fourth commandment that's set aside in the New Testament? And if so, why is it set aside? How do we know that it's set aside? Yeah, what do we do with all those kinds of questions? Those are very legitimate questions, and it's worth exploring. But we're not going to take time to do that in the context of Leviticus chapter 23. Again, we might have it as a postscript once we get done with all of Leviticus's 27 chapters. But we've just finished the first of the holy days for a holy God that is mentioned in Leviticus chapter 23. So we've got 6 others. Maybe we'll get through them in the next lesson. Maybe we won't. We may have to do this for 3 lessons. But in any event, Lord willing, we will pick up with the second of those appointed times set for the people by the Lord next time when we meet for these lessons. So hopefully you'll be able to join us then.